I'm Lee Milan, and in this video, we're going to look at Ableton Live's analog instrument device. So I'm just going to load this in first before we talk about what analog actually is. So analog's modeled around a classic subtractive synthesizer, which in this case revolves around two oscillators and a noise oscillator. So the two oscillators of analog are variable in terms of the waveform you can choose. We have a sine wave, a sawtooth, a pulse wave, and then a noise source as well. But our middle oscillator here is the one that is a pure noise source. So let's go through the classic architecture of a subtractive synthesizer. So it always starts off with the actual oscillator itself. So I'm going to turn off lots of things that I don't need right now. So we have two oscillators enabled. So let's turn off the first oscillator. The filter section here, these little tabs here as you click around them are called shells. And this filter shell is enabled, so I'll turn that off for now until we need it. And then let's go to our first oscillator. So if I just play it, you'll hear what the sawtooth sounds like. Okay, if I click into the chooser menu for the waveform type, I can use the up and down arrow and we can hear the differences between these waveforms. Okay, so let's go back to our sawtooth oscillator here as well. So the principles of subtractive synthesis are basically that you go from a potentially big sounding waveform. So in this case, it's a sawtooth, which is basically all the odd and even harmonics of the harmonic series. So it's a lot of information in a sound. And then we use filtering and amplitude shaping to hone this in and craft it into something that's a little bit more shaped and musical. So if I go to the amp section first, which is over here. Now the amp section has what we call an envelope. So the envelope here controls volume over time. So the attack stage, which I can either grab and move here, or I can move the numeric value here, or dial in the exact amount of milliseconds I think I need, allows me to go from having either a sharp, immediate volume increase or a slow volume increase, which creates a soft attack. So I'll just increase that while I press the keys. Then after the attack stage, it moves to the sustain stage, which is this level control here. So this attack stage is a time control. How long does it take to go from the lowest volume to the highest? And then the next stage takes us to the sustain level, which is this level here. So if I increase the sustain up, that basically means that once I've struck the key and we've gone past the attack stage, we are going to stay at full volume because the sustain is at full volume as well. However, if I lower the sustain, we have another travel factor in here. We have the attack stage, but then we have the decay stage, so which takes us from the top of the end of the attack, which is the highest volume, and then lets us choose how long it takes to get to that sustain. So what we can do is have a lower sustain and play with that decay. So it's a fast attack, so it's going to immediately get to full volume, but then we can play around with how long the decay takes to take us down to that sustain level. So you can just hear it in the background. That's our sustain being very low. So we've had a treble down of the decay going down to the sustain. So if you want to increase the time it takes, remember that you've got the attack stage, kind of create a flyby sound where it comes in slowly and it also disappears slowly too. So the sustain can go back up, and then if we just bring our attack so it's a bit more percussive and fast, the release stage is how long it takes to go from the current volume the sound's at whenever you take your finger off the key, how long it takes to go from that volume down to silence. So the release stage, if it's increased a lot, is good for pad type sounds or things that you want to just have a soft disappearance of in terms of how long it takes to go to silence. Okay, so that's the basics of the amplitude section. Now if we go to the filter section, we turn that on. We have different types of filters. So we have to summarize a fair bit at this point in terms of just going through the basic overview of analog, but we have a low pass filter, which means anything below this frequency setting will be passed or will pass through, and anything above it will be rejected. And then there's the opposite version of this filter, which is the high pass filter. Anything below that frequency setting will be rejected, anything above it will pass. The high will pass. And the other option is the low will pass. So the other things we have is a bandpass, which is kind of like a combination of the two, where anything above and below the chosen cutoff of that filter will be rejected and the central bit will remain. And then finally, we have some more kind of creative options here. We have a notch filter, which is a little bit like a block of butter, and you decide to get a sharp knife and you just chop a little triangle out the middle. It will do that to the frequencies and create a notch in the sound. And then finally, we have some formant filters, which add resonances in the sound, which give us like a vocalized kind of sound. So I'm going to just pull the position of the filter down and press the key while we play the formant filter here. Let's try the other formant filter. Okay, so we can hear that that's creating like a vocalized tone to the sound. If we increase the resonance, we can kind of just accent the actual, the peaks that the filters add into the sound. Now, just like the amplitude had an envelope which had an attack, decay, sustain, and then release stage to it, our filter has that too. And the application of the envelope to the filter can be changed. So my current position is 1K, so 1000 Hertz for the current starting position of the filter. And then what's happening is the envelope's pulling it up, going to a sustain stage, just like the amplitude has the option to do, and then there's a release stage as well. So you'll hear when I hold the key, very quickly, that release stage is quite short and it's quickly bringing the filter down to its starting static position. So if I increase the release of the envelope, it will take longer for the filter to return to its resting state. We should hear a bit more of a slow movement of that filter down. It takes quite a while for it to go down to that resting state as well. So we'll look at these more in context with some presets in a minute. I just want to make sure we understand the principles of the envelopes and how they affect amplitude and the filter position too. So other aspects we have to modify the sound in terms of its properties, in terms of this oscillator one, is we have an LFO section, which is an oscillator that's incredibly low in pitch. So rather than us hearing a pitch from the sound because it's running very fast in terms of the waveform, it's running at a speed that's slow enough that we're hearing upwards and downwards travel, which to our ears becomes rhythmic. So if I have, let's say, LFO1 enabled, which I just turned it on there in the LFO shell, then I go over to something I want to change the properties of. So let's go to the filter settings. You'll see there's a frequency modulation and a resonance modulation. So that frequency was the resting state of this filter. The envelope is pulling it up and pulling it down. We can also get the LFO to also alter it. So if I start increasing that as I play it, you'll hear that there's a motion up and down action happening to the filter. Now if I increase the speed of the LFO, you can hear that although the envelope's still modifying the filter position, now the LFO is also creating travel of upwards and downwards motion as well. So if we change the filter back to a low pass, you can hear quite a classic sound in terms of what happens to the filter. General pulsing low pass filter that's running through that too. If I pull the release in, my notes can be a little bit more staccato, so they'll start and stop very quickly when I take my fingers on and off the keys. And that's how the LFO section works. We can choose the LFO to be in the amplitude section. There's an area for it there. And we could also go to the waveform section, and there's also LFO options of how we can make that movement be applied to different parameters within the instrument. So the final kind of thing to talk about, we're talking about oscillator 1, which then applies to oscillator 2 because they're both mirrors of each other in terms of the parameters that are available, is the pitch envelope. So as well as the filter envelope and the amp envelope, we have a pitch envelope here, which is quite a simple envelope. We have an initial starting point, so it either starts at the 0 resting state, so it doesn't modify the pitch, or we start it high up and then we allow it to travel down over time. And then the time factor is done in percent, so we kind of have to do that by ear in terms of how quick we want it to go from the higher state to the lower state as well. So let's try that. Okay, so that movement of the LFO as well can be synchronized. At the moment, it's a free running LFO, so it's not taking any notice of what the tempo is in Ableton Live. So if I put it into sync mode, we change the rate. Okay, so that's the LFO section and how it can modify the sound. So the other shells we have to look at is the general kind of global shell here, which gives us an options of routing. So how the oscillators are routed into filters, and then how the output, the filters are either routed into the next filter or they're routed to the amplitude section where we played with those envelopes. Which can be manually done in terms of these variable menus that we have here, in terms of changing the degree at which it goes to filter 1 and filter 2, or we can go to this global shell and we can just choose a preset routing option based on what it is that we want to do. Quite interesting to experiment with this when you load in a preset and you want to kind of give it another tonality. Maybe you want to make a copy so you have a second sound, and then play around with the routing and see how it affects the sound that's loaded in. Another important aspect to think about is the vibrato, which is basically pitch LFO, but it's a designated tool to do it, so you don't eat up your LFOs doing it from the LFO section. So if I increase the amount of vibrato, let me just turn off the pitch envelope for a minute. Let's put that to 0. So it's not distracting us from what the vibrato is doing. Let's just decrease the amount of LFO modulation. We can hear the effect of the percent, which is how much it can pull the pitch of the oscillator up and down. And we can hear the effect of the rate, which is how fast it goes. So for a true vibrato, we wouldn't really go for something slow. We go for something a lot faster that sounds a bit more like a kind of a singing voice, an operatic voice. Okay, so next option we have in this global shell is our unison mode, which is a way of doing what we can do with multiple oscillators, but again, it's a designated area that does it for us. Now, when we enable unison mode, you'll notice there's a unison voices drop-down menu, and that's how many additional voices are going to be added to our original voice. So if we go for 2 voices and I increase the detune, it's like we've added more oscillators and we're just offsetting the tuning of them from each other, which thickens the sound as the frequencies fight with each other and create a sense of movement. So let's increase the detune. So without. Okay, let's increase the voices and see how that changes. So you can hear it's got a lot more thicker sound to it because there's more layers of the oscillators playing with each other. So the noise oscillator is here, and if we just have that enabled, our color control is literally like an EQ in terms of reducing the amount of top frequencies in there. As I said, oscillator 2 is a mirror image of oscillator 1. It's independent, we can set it separately, but the actual features are the same between the two. So once you've learnt the first one, you can apply the same knowledge to the second oscillator as well. Okay, so the last part of the global shell that we're going to look at is the glissando function. So I have it enabled here. I need to turn my oscillator 1 back on to hear it. Now at the moment, if I hold a lower note and a higher note, it's going to glide between the 2 notes. Okay, now at the moment they're overlapping each other. It's called polyphonic behavior. And we really want the glide to behave in a way that it sounds like someone playing one string on an instrument and sliding between one position and the next. So if we go to voices, we can reduce the amount of available voices that will go over each other, or the available notes we can play. So if we set it to monophonic, and we try the glide again, here it sounds quite different. There's a glide between the first and the second note. So we have normal behavior where any movement between the two notes, even if there's a gap in between them, it does a glide. Or we have legato mode, which if we play in a, leave little rests in between the notes, they'll play as normal. But as soon as we let one note overlap the next note, we get the glide behavior. So from a performance point of view, or from an editing in the MIDI editor point of view, that's quite useful in terms of having the dynamics of having really certain musical pitch and be able to move between playing short bursts of notes that are very clear in pitch and then glide in between some as well. So it's a very expressive function. Right, so let's try some presets. So we can go to instruments and go to the analog presets here. We can also go to the hot swap button and try out some of the presets in the analog library that way too. So let's try and find something, and we'll use what we've learned to just tailor in the sound to our own needs as we go. Okay, so this instrument here, okay, I like the tone of the lower stuff, but the whoop type sound is a resonance of the filter, where I talked about it earlier, where it's really pushing a very loud peak of the sound, and we're hearing the motion of that filter. So going off what we've covered so far, if I play this patch and try and tailor it to my needs, if I reduce the resonance, we should get a less kind of prominent movement of the filter, so it won't overpower the kind of the oscillator sound that's coming through. Okay, so that's really brought it in terms of that strong resonance not overpowering the preset there. So let's try another preset and let's see if we can. Okay, so we've got like an acid bass. But let's say for context, I like the motion of the filter, but the filter is taking too long for the tempo that I'm working at. It needs to be tighter and shorter. So let's have a look at what's moving the filter. Let's go to the filter shell. And we have a decay, which is fairly high, running down to the lowest position the filter will go to, which is the stain all the way at the bottom. So let's try that decay setting. Okay, so that's a little bit tighter, but we do have two filters running here. So let's go to the second filter and look at the properties of the envelope there. So we've got a decay. Now, if you're not too sure where the sound's coming from in terms of which one's producing what sound, we can disable the filters. And in fact, disabling that first filter has got me closer to the timbre of the sound that I preferred out of the two kind of layers that are in there. Okay, so that works. We tighten that up and it's a bit more usable for the context of what we're going for. So let's just move away from bass for a last example of how we can apply this. Let's go to some pad sounds. Okay, so this is called a thin sweep pad. So it's basically, I imagine, yes, it's using a high pass filter. So it's using that filter that anything below the filter position gets rejected and we just hear the top. And they've set it fairly high, so we're just hearing quite the wispy higher frequencies of the sound. So maybe I like the nature of this sound, but I want it to be that we have a bit more body to it. So let's have a look at the position of the filter. So if we go to the frequency of the filter, so that's its resting state before envelopes or LFOs can pull it up or down, let's drop that down a bit and see if we can get a bit more body into the sound. Okay, so that's a lot more body in that sound. It's lost a little bit of the movement, so we can always try and find the sweet spot between those two settings. Okay, so that's sounding nice. Now there's a sort of noise aspect to it in the background as well. If I want to pinpoint what it is, again, we can turn the oscillators or the noise oscillator shells on and off to figure out where parts of these sounds are coming from. So I'm going to actually isolate all the 3 sound sources in this instrument. Okay, so we can hear that noise now. So either I can change the color, just darken it a little bit, get rid of the sort of sizzle at the tops, or I can turn it off entirely and just remove it from the equation. So we've looked at Ableton Live's analog instrument device. It's a subtractive synthesizer, so if you understand the basics that we've covered now, you should be able to find your way around other subtractive synthesizers quite easily. And the whole idea of this video was to get you used to the main building components: oscillator, filter, amplitude, and also modulation from envelopes or LFOs.